If you're watching this, then that probably means you're aware that The Last of Us Part 2 came out. And if you're aware that The Last of Us Part 2 came out, then you're probably aware that this has made a lot of people very, very upset. Rather than try to weave together some intricate introduction, I'm just gonna come out and say, I liked The Last of Us Part 2. And I know that probably doesn't mean very much, but I truly believe that it can only be understood to its fullest by playing through it yourself with as little knowledge on the story and spoilers as possible. So please, if you have any interest in diving in for yourself or watching alongside your favorite creator, I highly recommend stopping whatever this is to go and experience writing by those who rightfully write for a living, because I'll be spoiling so much stuff. And even though it won't be everything about the game, I know you're too smart for your own good and will just end up inferring everything else from context. This, for all intents and purposes, is my defense for The Last of Us Part 2. This is not an argument for the game being a flawless 10 out of 10 masterpiece, because I realize it's not perfect. No game can be. I do think it's very good, but I realize how subjective most, if not all, of my reasons are, so it stands as more of an argument for it being an important title, which, even though its narrative went in a direction that was difficult, it was ambitious nonetheless, and the risks taken here should be commended. Somewhat similar to how I think Death Stranding is so important, because of how it's able to blend gameplay so well with its narrative themes. Except this game's fun. The negative attention you've likely seen circulating in this game is almost exclusively because of its narrative decisions, not necessarily because it's poorly made. In fact, the game as I experienced it appears masterfully crafted, and it's clear that everyone involved harbors not only a lot of passion for their work, but a hell of a lot of talent as well. It looks fantastic, with each environment being complex and atmospheric. It sounds incredible, from the music to the sound effects to the god tier of voice acting, and somehow it all runs extremely well. I only ran into one issue where it crashed in the beginning of my playthrough, something which I can't help but to contribute to my dusty jet engine of a PS4 trying to push out probably the most visually intensive console game ever made on hardware that's old enough to clap me in Warzone, which, if anything, adds to how impressive it is that the game is able to run as well as it does otherwise. Now, some reviewers are making the argument that aside from the narrative, the gameplay is a problem as well because it doesn't do enough to improve upon the previous title and ends up feeling mediocre because of it. This is definitely fair and should be considered, but I don't think it carries nearly as much weight as it may seem because the gameplay, or more specifically the combat, movement, progression, and crafting, are all essentially pulled from the first game, which was kind of one of the most beloved titles ever made, and improved upon in every aspect. So the problem here isn't that it's bad per se, it's more of an I expected more type of response, which again is totally fair, but I guarantee that if there weren't narrative contentions like there are, these issues with gameplay wouldn't contribute to it dropping anywhere near a 1 or even 0 out of 5 like it currently sits with a lot of people. Now, I've been mentioning that much of the negative reaction has come as a result of the narrative, but I'd like to clarify that for the most part, the issue isn't with the dialogue, story structure, or pacing, though I suppose that's up for debate. Instead, the real divisive part is how its characters, or rather one character specifically, are handled. In the first hours of The Last of Us Part 2, Joel, the beloved protagonist from the first Last of Us and one of gaming's favorite little monsters, is brutalized by Abby, a character players were only just recently introduced to. I just have to say that playing through this fucking sucked. I felt such a concentrated anger in the pit of my stomach that I had to get up and take a lap around my room at the risk of straight destructo-disking my DualShock through my neighbor's window. I, like our protagonist Ellie, hated Abby and was completely on board to hunt her down. This also marks the point where the writers began to face the music, where they had to get to work to make sure the game could achieve what it set out to do, to make the players feel a real, tangible impact from its theme, that being that vengeance is cyclical and the violence it brings is mutually destructive, and they chose to kick it all off by sacrificing Joel. It was at this moment, with an entire 25 plus hours of game and more importantly context ahead of me, where it was all too easy to feel that anger over the loss of Joel and doubt Naughty Dog's ability to reconcile for their crime against Gamer. That's stupid. And this feeling, it got so much worse before it got better. Upon reaching roughly the halfway point, players stop controlling Ellie, who they've been suffering and bonding with for the past 12 or so hours, not to mention an entire other game, and instead take control of Abby, to replay the events of the last 3 days from her perspective. If Joel's death was the writers facing the music, then this was them putting up the subwoofers and blasting that Jellyfish jam, because now they had to perform what I can only imagine is one of the most difficult narrative stunts to pull off, justifying Joel's death and making an antagonist as villainized as Abby truly empathetic. To tell you the truth, I hated playing Abby so much at the start that I intentionally tried to kill her, and when that didn't work, because of course it didn't, I outright refused to upgrade any of her weapons or her stats, because I refused to let her improve as much as I did Ellie. I made the game objectively more difficult for myself out of spite for a fictional character in a video game. At the time, I was unimpressed because I felt like the potency of my anger was unearned. It felt like Naughty Dog was flaunting Joel's death only as a means to create synthetic anger. But upon finishing the game, I've come to realize that this wasn't a nefarious act, but instead a necessary one. If the end result had been less impressive, I may have walked away feeling differently, but as it stands, I believe that this story would not have been anywhere near as impactful if Joel hadn't been killed and if we hadn't been forced to spend so much time with Abby. And somehow, after suffering through a few hours with Abby in that second half, I began to realize that Naughty Dog's plan might actually be working. At first, I shrugged off all of Abby's relationships, from her dad, to her friends, to the dog. Just kidding, I like the dog. But as the drama continued and her morals as well as her flaws began to show through, I actually started to feel for her. This reached a tipping point after spending so much time with Lev and Yara, two kids from a rival faction of Seraphites who at one point save Abby from an execution. Abby, who then repeatedly goes out of her way to endanger herself in order to protect and save them for no other reason than she feels morally obligated to. This was the start of her redemption in my eyes, the player. She endured so much and made difficult moral decisions, and as it all went on, I started to realize how much of her experience and Ellie's were paralleled. Both being raised in a world where trust is fragile and fleeting and violence is inevitable. Both trying to maintain normal romantic relationships but being caught up in weird pregnancy love triangles. Both putting those they care about in danger for their fruitless pursuit of revenge in the name of the father figures they had unjustly stolen from them. I'm so impressed because not only were they able to completely shift my perspective on this character from abhorrence to compassion, but it also made me feel sick to my stomach knowing all the terrible things I had already done to her friends as Ellie. This is kind of the quintessential point of how the game's thematic impact was able to be so damn effective. Player responsibility. Playing through Seattle twice, spending so much time with both Ellie and Abby allowed the player to not only bond with the characters as they overcame tremendous odds, like hordes of enemies and the Rat King, but also made it so that almost every single character death occurred because of the player. I led Abby towards a hideout to find Joel. I took Ellie on a murder spree throughout Seattle. I killed Abby's friends without care because they were just video game enemies in my way, just a means to an end. This is also why I refuse to play the game through a second time, at least at the moment, because as much as I love it and I want to go for that cool platinum trophy, I can't bring myself to endure that tragedy all over again, because the way I view each of these characters has changed. I value them more as the people they represent and thus call my own morals into question for being so okay with so much of the violence against them in the first place. And the very fact that I'm asking questions like this and reading so much into it and writing a fourth video script on it is evidence enough for me that this story was a tremendous success. But that's kind of the thing, for me. This leads into the last little bit I wanted to talk about. Of course, not everyone will have been affected in the same way by this game, and it would be ignorant of me to assume otherwise. It is 100% okay if you do not like this game. It comes with the territory of being considered an art form that video games and the stories they tell are subjective, and as such, not everyone is going to enjoy them the same way, if at all, and that's okay. If you were following gaming on the internet before the release of The Last of Us Part 2, then you're likely aware that many of its key story beats were leaked, including Joel's death at the hands of Abby and the subsequent playing as her for a considerable portion of the game. This understandably led to a lot of outrage, and it's for the same reason I mentioned earlier. Knowing only that a beloved character is murdered by a stranger and that you'll be forced to play as them for half of the game sounds terrible without the context provided by the game. Even when finally playing the game, all the way up until a moment several hours into playing as Abby, which was, 18 hours total, I was still frustrated and doubtful. That's a lot of time needed to convince players of your cause, and a lot of opportunity for players to put down their controllers without having much of a reason to pick them back up again. Which is totally justifiable. Naughty Dog is selling a product, and it's the consumer's decision whether or not to buy and play it. What worries me is that some of the anger from the leaks may have been carried over into post-release, where it's being compounded with that of people who aren't seeing the game all the way through. I worry that there are people out there who won't get to experience this game because they're being misguided by peers who are turning people away because they themselves feel cheated by what Naughty Dog did. Which I can't completely blame them for, since when the cost of conveying a message like this is a beloved character like Joel, if the message doesn't come across, then players are entitled to feel cheated. I guess what I'm trying to say in a super roundabout way is that this game deserves a chance. The massive amount of love and effort that went into it is reason enough, but I can personally say that the message Naughty Dog was trying to convey worked for me, and I believe it worked for a lot of other people, which is why there are so many perfect scores out there, because when it works, it really works. It has the ability to convey a tremendously impactful narrative experience that capitalizes on that which makes video games unique, their interactive element. It's because they took such a big risk in trying this with their beloved Last of Us story when they could have just as easily made nothing, or even worse, a story with no risks at all, that has earned them my respect, and I hope that people can see why.